In the kingdom of Valdria, a small yet influential monarchy located in Eastern Europe, whispers of a fearful prince reverberated through the halls of its ancient palaces. Prince Kaelen Durnov, heir to the throne, was a man whose name alone struck fear into those who dared speak of him. Cold, calculated, and ruthless, Kaelen had led his nation through countless battles, never once flinching in the face of danger. His reputation was as sharp as the steel of his sword, but the true strength of Prince Kaelen lay not in his military prowess, but in his ability to maintain control over his people. His icy demeanor kept his court in constant submission. The people of Valdria feared him, yes, but they also respected him. The prince's power was absolute, and his heart, seemingly frozen, was the key to his empire's stability. Then came Lady Seraphina Valderis, a woman whose beauty and intelligence rivaled even the noblest women of the land. She was a member of an old and noble family from the neighboring city of Marvois, a place known for its rich cultural heritage and political influence. But unlike the noble women who adorned their beauty with delicate smiles, Seraphina was reserved, calculating and deeply troubled by the arrangements made by her family. The union between Seraphina and Prince Kaelen was not born of love, but of necessity. Her family, seeking to strengthen their political position and gain access to the royal court, had arranged for the two to marry. For Kaelen, it was simply a political tool, another string to his bow. But Seraphina carried with her a secret, one that would change everything. As the wedding day approached, the city of Marvois buzzed with excitement, its streets lined with royal banners, and its palace shining in the afternoon sun. Yet beneath the surface of the festivities, a dark tension swirled, for Seraphina's secret had the power to destroy everything. The prince had never seen her as anything more than a pawn in his grand scheme, but Seraphina wasn't about to be anyone's pawn. The grand palace of Marvois stood at the heart of the city, its towering spires piercing the sky like the arms of an ancient, silent sentinel. On the day of their meeting, the halls were filled with anticipation, the air thick with the whispers of servants and nobles preparing for the grand occasion. Seraphina stood near the grand staircase, her heart racing despite her calm exterior. Her family had placed the weight of their future upon her shoulders, and she would carry this burden through the long corridors of the palace. As she gazed into the mirror, adjusting her gown, she caught a fleeting glimpse of her reflection, young, poised, yet burdened with a secret that no one could ever truly understand. The doors to the hall opened, and in walked Prince Kaelen Durnov, a figure whose very presence seemed to still the room. His cold, calculating gaze swept across the gathered assembly before resting on Seraphina. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension, and for the first time Seraphina felt the weight of their union settle on her chest like a leaden burden. Kaelen's eyes held no warmth, no recognition, only a detached interest as he approached her. He was every bit the feared prince his reputation painted him to be. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes as cold and piercing as the icy winds that swept across the mountain ranges surrounding Valdria. His face was a mask of indifference, a prince who had learned long ago not to show emotion. "You must be Lady Seraphina." Kaelen's voice was smooth, his words crisp, but there was no hint of warmth in them. He spoke as though he were merely addressing a stranger in a crowded room. Seraphina nodded, her lips pressing into a polite smile. "Your Highness, I trust you are well." "I am," he said simply, his gaze flickering briefly over her before returning to the horizon, as though already dismissing her. "This arranged union will strengthen both of our families. Let us not dwell on unnecessary pleasantries." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence between them. Seraphina could feel the tension mounting, not just from their words, but from the way he looked at her, as though she were little more than a pawn in his political game. She had known Kaelen's reputation for years, heard the rumors of his coldness and his ability to crush anyone who dared cross him. But standing face to face with him, she realized that the man before her was even colder than the stories had painted. His eyes, though mesmerizing, felt like an empty void, and his words, though measured, held no emotion. Kaelen's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't one of warmth, but of something darker, something that made Seraphina's skin prickle with unease. "I trust you will perform your duties well, Lady Seraphina," he said, his voice like ice cutting through the air. "After all, your family's future depends on this." The words hit Seraphina like a blow. His arrogance was palpable, and his treatment of her was a reminder of the position she had been forced into. But instead of shrinking beneath the weight of his gaze, Seraphina held her ground. "Your Highness," she began, her voice steady, "I am fully aware of the stakes, but I also understand the importance of mutual respect in any alliance, even one of this nature." Kaelen raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her defiance. "Respect? In marriage?" "In any arrangement, Your Highness. The strength of a union lies in the trust between those involved, no matter how unlikely that might seem." His eyes narrowed slightly, but his lips remained in that faint, almost imperceptible smile. "We shall see, Lady Seraphina." As Kaelen turned to leave, a momentary flicker of something passed between them. An unspoken understanding, perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply the beginning of the battle that would define the rest of their lives. Days passed after their first meeting, and the marriage preparations continued without much change. The grand halls of Marvois Palace became a blur of silk and velvet, the air filled with the sound of preparations for the upcoming union. But beneath the surface of the ceremonial facade, something was shifting. Prince Kaelen and Seraphina were forced to spend more time together, their daily encounters more frequent now that the wedding was drawing closer. At first, Kaelen remained as cold and distant as ever, treating Seraphina with the same indifference he had shown during their first meeting. He was a man of duty, and emotions had no place in his world of calculated decisions and rigid control. But Seraphina, as she had done so many times before, found a way to endure. She had always been good at reading people, understanding their intentions, even if they tried to hide them. And despite his icy exterior, she began to notice something in Kaelen, something faint but undeniable. A crack in his facade, a flicker of emotion that would appear in the briefest of moments. One evening, as they walked through the grand garden of the palace, the air crisp with the cool autumn breeze, Kaelen spoke. "You seem quiet tonight, Lady Seraphina." His voice was low, though there was no mistaking the sharpness in his words. But there was something different about this question. He wasn't merely making a remark. It was as though he actually wanted to know. Seraphina glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat. It was rare for him to speak with anything resembling genuine interest. "I am simply thinking," she replied, keeping her voice measured. "There is much on my mind." Kaelen turned to her, his eyes piercing through her with their usual intensity. But this time, there was something softer in his gaze. "And what, may I ask, is troubling you so?" The question caught her off guard. She had always believed that Kaelen saw her as nothing more than a pawn in his grand game of power. But in that moment, his expression seemed almost curious. It was subtle, but it was there. "I am just reflecting on what lies ahead," Seraphina answered, her voice softer than she intended. She had to remind herself that she could not afford to show weakness, not in front of him. "This marriage is a turning point not just for me, but for everyone involved." Kaelen's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but he said nothing. They continued walking in silence, the only sound being the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. And for the first time since meeting him, Seraphina felt the weight of his presence in a way she hadn't before. Not as a prince, but as a man, perhaps as lost as she was in the maze of expectations and duty. As the weeks went by, they grew more accustomed to each other. Kaelen still maintained his detached demeanor, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when his mask slipped. He would look at Seraphina in a way that made her heart race, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of leadership bearing down on him. One night, as they sat across from each other at a banquet, Seraphina noticed that Kaelen was not his usual self. His gaze was distant and he seemed to be lost in thought. She watched him for a moment, then without thinking spoke. "You are troubled, Prince Kaelen." He looked up, clearly surprised by her observation. "You're perceptive, Lady Seraphina," he said, his tone somewhat softer than usual. But I am always troubled. It is the price of being in a position like mine. Seraphina considered his words carefully. I suppose it must be, she said quietly. I imagine the burden is heavy. Kaelen nodded slowly. It is. Every decision I make affects not just me but my people, my kingdom. There is no room for mistakes. His words were laden with an unspoken vulnerability, a side of him Seraphina had not expected to see. She had always known him to be a man of strength and resolve, but now she saw something more human, something that, for a fleeting moment, made her question everything she had thought about him. And in that moment she realized that this marriage, this union that had once seemed like nothing more than a political alliance, might not be as simple as she had thought. There was more beneath the surface, both in Kaelen and in herself, than either of them had expected. It was the night before their wedding, and the grand hall of Marvois Palace shimmered with the glow of thousands of candles. The scent of roses filled the air, and the tapestries lining the walls seemed to come alive in the warm golden light. Yet, beneath the surface of this elaborate celebration, Seraphina's heart beat heavy with a secret she had kept hidden for far too long. She had always known this moment would come, but it had never felt more imminent than now. The weight of the truth she carried threatened to crush her, and she could no longer bear to live with the lie. Tomorrow she would marry Kaelen, a man who had grown to know her well, yet still had no idea who she truly was. But Seraphina wasn't the only one harboring a secret. Kaelen had spent the last few days preparing for the wedding as though it were a ritual, just another political maneuver to ensure his control over the people of Valdria. But something was shifting inside him. He had begun to question things not just about Seraphina, but about the life he had been forced to live. The burden of the crown, the unrelenting expectations, the loneliness that seemed to follow him everywhere. It was all beginning to eat away at him. And then on the eve of the wedding, everything changed. Seraphina was alone in her chambers, staring out the window at the full moon, when a soft knock echoed through the door. She turned, her heart racing, already knowing who it was. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, she felt unsure of what would come next. Come in, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The door opened, and Kaelen stepped inside, his usual regal composure replaced with something far more raw. His eyes, usually cold and distant, were now filled with a mixture of anger, frustration, and something else, something that almost resembled fear. Seraphina, he said, his voice gruff. There are things I need to know, things I should have asked you earlier, but I was too blind to see them. Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. There was a moment of silence between them, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. What is it, Prince Kaelen? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Kaelen took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Why did you agree to this marriage? Seraphina swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She knew this question was coming. She had rehearsed an answer 100 times in her mind, but now, with him standing so close, the words felt foreign on her tongue. She couldn't lie to him anymore, not after everything they had shared. Because I had no choice, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Because my family needed this. And I was expected to do my duty. Kaelen's jaw tightened. And what of your own feelings? Have you no will of your own? She didn't answer at first, her mind racing. What could she say? That she had been forced into this union? That she had known from the beginning that she would never be happy with him? But the truth, as painful as it was, felt like it would tear her apart. I had no choice, she repeated, her voice cracking slightly. But there's more, Kaelen. There's something you don't know, something I've kept hidden from everyone. His eyes darkened. What is it? Seraphina took a deep breath. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, as though the very earth itself was pulling her into a chasm of truth and consequences. It was time. I am not who you think I am, she whispered. My name, Seraphina Valderis. It's a lie. I am not the daughter of the Valderis family. I am the daughter of the king of Marvois, the very same king who once tried to assassinate your father." Kaelen froze, his face draining of color. He stared at her, disbelief in his eyes. "What did you say?" "I've been sent here as a spy, Kaelen," Seraphina continued, her voice barely audible. "I've been watching you, learning everything I can about your plans and the people you trust, but I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted this marriage. It was my father's decision. I was meant to destroy you." The confession hung between them like a terrible storm cloud, dark and oppressive. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Kaelen's expression twisted between anger and confusion, his mind struggling to process the flood of emotions that his heart could hardly bear. "Why?" he asked hoarsely, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and pain. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why pretend to be someone else?" "Because I was afraid," Seraphina admitted, her voice breaking. "Afraid of what you would do when you found out. Afraid of losing everything, including you." For a long time, Kaelen didn't speak. He stood there frozen, his face a mask of anger and betrayal, his hands balled into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. But then, slowly, his expression softened. It was the barest of changes, but it was enough for Seraphina to see it, the vulnerability that had always been lurking behind his icy facade. Kaelen looked up at her, his eyes clouded with pain. "I don't know what to feel right now," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "You've lied to me. You've betrayed my trust in the worst way possible." Seraphina's heart shattered at the words, but she knew they were true. She had betrayed him, even if it had been in the name of duty. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said again, this time more softly. "I never wanted any of this." For a moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of her confession hanging in the air like 1,000 unsaid words. Kaelen's mind raced, torn between betrayal and the strange feeling of relief that came with knowing the truth. But as the minutes stretched on, he knew one thing for certain. This marriage, this union, was no longer just a political affair. It had become something far more personal, and the path ahead was uncertain. The next few days passed in a blur of emotions for both Kaelen and Seraphina. The revelation of her true identity had shattered the fragile connection they had built, leaving them both reeling. Kaelen, torn between his duty to his people and his personal feelings for Seraphina, found himself at a crossroads. The betrayal ran deep, yet there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the sincerity in her eyes when she admitted her fears. Seraphina, for her part, felt as though the world had crumbled around her. She had spent so long pretending to be someone else, hiding her true self behind a facade. And now, as the truth came to light, she was left wondering if she had made a mistake by ever agreeing to this marriage. She had never wanted to deceive Kaelen, but the weight of her family's expectations had always been too heavy to escape. The night before their wedding, the palace was eerily quiet. The grand halls that had once been bustling with excitement were now subdued, as if the air itself had grown heavy with the tension between them. Kaelen stood at the balcony of his chambers, staring out into the moonlit landscape. The weight of the crown, the responsibility of his people, and the uncertainty of his marriage all weighed on him, pressing down harder than he had ever felt before. "Kaelen?" He turned, surprised to see Seraphina standing in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. Her eyes, once full of hesitation and fear, were now steady, though still shadowed with regret. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Kaelen looked at her, his gaze searching her face as if looking for something, anything that could give him clarity. But all he saw was the woman who had lied to him, the woman he had once thought he might share his life with. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "I'm not sure I can ever be ready for this." Seraphina's heart sank, but she didn't show it. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her breath catching in her chest as she stood before him. "I know I've betrayed your trust," she said, her voice trembling slightly. And I know that I can never undo the damage I've done, but I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted this life for myself. I was just following orders." Kaelen remained silent, his eyes softening as he listened. He could feel the truth in her words, the sincerity behind them, and for the first time since their first meeting, he realized that Seraphina wasn't just a pawn in some political game. She was a person, someone who had been caught in the web of her own family's ambitions, just as he had been caught in his own. "You have a choice now," Kaelen said, his voice quieter than usual. "You don't have to be what they want you to be. You can choose a different path, Seraphina. We both can." Seraphina looked up at him, her heart pounding. She had never imagined that Kaelen, the prince who had once seemed so distant and cold, would offer her such a lifeline. But in that moment, she saw the man he could be, the man who wasn't defined by the title he carried, but by the choices he made. "I don't want to be trapped anymore," Seraphina whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want this life for either of us." Kaelen stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Then let's make a choice together. Let's face whatever comes next, not as enemies but as equals." For a moment, the weight of their responsibilities and the expectations of their families seemed to fade away. There, in the quiet of the palace, Kaelen and Seraphina stood side by side, two souls who had been bound by fate and circumstance, but who had now found a common ground, a new path forward, free from the chains that had once bound them. The next morning, the grand wedding ceremony was set to take place. But it wasn't the wedding the world had expected. Instead of a grand union between two royal families, it was a quiet decision made in the heart of the palace. Kaelen and Seraphina stood together at the altar, not as a prince and his bride, but as two individuals who had come to understand the weight of their own choices. As they exchanged vows, there was no grand declaration of love, no promise of eternal happiness. Instead, there was something deeper, a recognition of the journey they had both undertaken, the understanding that their lives would never be the same again. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the prince and his bride made their vows, not to the crown, but to each other, to the possibility of building something true, something real, despite the lies, the secrets, and the expectations. In the end, Kaelen and Seraphina's marriage was not a political alliance. It was not the grand union that had been planned for so long. It was a union forged by the trials they had endured together, a recognition of their shared humanity, and the realization that, despite everything that had happened, they still had the power to choose their own destinies. And so the story of Prince Kaelen and Seraphina did not end with a grand celebration, but with a quiet beginning. Together they stepped forward, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them, not as a prince and his bride, but as two people who had found each other amidst the chaos of the world.